2, 1. There is a specific problem for those who enter into prison and then exit it 20 years later, entering into a world that is unfamiliar to them, one that they have been alienated from since the very beginning. We believe that a model of simulated incarceration fixes these problems for many of these people in specific, as well as fulfills the principled obligation of a state towards its prisoners. I forgot to mention earlier, I'll take POIs through chat. Preemptive framing. What does it mean to accurately simulate the experience of being in prison? So here we'll outline what we expect this policy to look like. So what this might look like for the prisoner is the prisoner will still undergo a prison routine. They'll still spend time in a cell and have AI simulations of inmates and therapists to talk to. As the info slide says, we expect them to view the simulation as fully real. So while they're inside, they will treat these simulations as human and will wipe the concept of AI from their memory until they exit the simulation. The realistic interpretation of this is that we start from the ideal experience of prison and extrapolate outwards. So we won't copy the median prison experience. Instead, we copy the abstract ideal prison experience and then modulated to each individual prisoner there. Moreover, we expect it to be safe. So we expect there to be fail safes. If the simulation goes awry, we'll have an instant stop button. We'll also have something to prevent stop gaps. Like if it goes beyond the 100 years or 50 years, the prison simulation will immediately stop. Before I move into substantive about how this reduces abuse, here is some principled framing as well, simply to explain just what this principle is in this roundabout. So this is not a debate about retribution versus rehabilitation, whether it's good to punish prisoners more or not, because on both sides we are punishing them and we will implement methods to ensure that if they do the crime, they will spend the time. Instead, this debate is about establishing how we have failed at imposing adequate and appropriate punishment to each individual prisoner. How every time they go to prison, they do not just spend the time, they also face a milieu of other harms that were not intended within the prison process and is specifically unfair to them. Why is this important to understand? First is because the prisons and the state generally have a special obligation not to do harm, since the prisoners are themselves people in the care of the prisoner in the prison, and the state, in its overwhelming power symmetry towards these people, has an immediate exigency not to harm these people beyond what it is intended to do. Secondly, the matter of fact is that when the prison commits harms against these individuals, since they are in a position of vulnerability themselves and they are in the care of the state, the prison itself commits a crime against these individuals, and as such, we have to be exceedingly careful when it comes to dealing with them. So, given that then, let's move on to the first argument. Should incarceration literally mean that the person loses the majority of their life? Before that, I'll take a POI from DJ. Go.
Okay, why can you actually say that for sure you will be able to maintain a model of moderated perfect prison conditions when there exist political incentives to actually make it super harsh in the simulation, because after all, it's a simulation?
That's a good question. We'll run that in the argument. Anyway, so here are the problems with physical real-world prisons that will outweigh this consideration, even if prison simulations might be bad. So there are 4 reasons as for why prisons right now are untenable in the physical real world. 1. Abuse, faced at the hands of convicts who frequently face violence at the hands of other prisoners, wardens who beat inmates, and prisoners who experience a brutally high rate of sexual assault, where gangs rule the prisonscape and force you to sign up with one of them in order to survive and force you to perpetuate a cycle of violence. The second problem in physical real-world prisons is a lack of resources and over-congestion. Many prisons simply do not have adequate amounts of food, adequate amounts of beds, medical resources to give the prisoners. Like in the Philippines, they take us to field trips to many of these prisons, and we witness these people languish in poverty and languish in situations that are simply untenable for the average person. Beyond that, there are a variety of underlying social incentives that I'm sure CEO will argue about why it is unpopular to advocate for giving resources to these individuals. Thirdly, there's also such a substantial amount of lost time and alienation faced when you exit prison. You come in and then you leave, and then you find the world has moved on without you. You've been socialized into prison culture, and you've been taught to react violently to other people in the micro interactions that you cannot erase. You've been forced. It becomes harder to reintegrate into society because social trends and cultural phenomena have moved without you. But the children, the people that you used to talk to have grown up and have left you behind. But aside from your personal relationships, your economic relationships with other people, you have a gigantic span of time where you haven't been working or productive at all, and everyone else in your cohort has moved on without you. Fourthly, the prison industrial complex also means that prisoners especially are used to do physical labor for cheap and in private prisons where they are paid based on how many prisoners they can cram in a single cell. This means that there's also an incentive from prisons to change laws in order to incarcerate people even more and make laws even harsher on the poor. These are 4 problems that are intractable in the status quo. How does our thing solve it? And note that this also directly responds to the POI, since I actually think it's a great POI, but here's why our problem solves it. The first is we have substantially more control. The problem in handling prisoners is not just the state wants to harm them, but also that it is almost impossible to regulate things adequately inside physical prisons. The trouble in handling physical prisons is that the status quo is twofold. We cannot monitor everyone. We simply do not have the manpower, but also the feeling of constantly having guards watch our every move actually increases the propensity for violence as people feel dehumanized and defaced under a draconian draconian system. But secondly, our side erases abuse with the flip of a switch. Even if prisons want to be harsh on individuals, that does not excuse something as galling and as viscerally harmful to the average citizen as something like simulated sexual assault or simulated brutal abuse. This means that even if some things might be bad in simulated prisons, they are substantially worse in the real life where they are not witnessed by the average citizen. Secondly, note that moderating physical prisons takes substantially more resources. So if it's a question of political capital and where prisoners might be more and where politicians might be more willing to support things, right? Our side requires substantially less budget in order to take care of each individual prisoner. It means that once the simulation has been created or once the technology has been created, it is trivial to make corrections to the code. It is trivial to make corrections internal to the simulation to make life better for these prisoners. If we're not giving them enough like digital food, you can press a button and add digital food. But if you need food for people in real prison life, you have to pay for that, and that comes at the cost of other things you might want to put on the docket as a politician. Before we move on, I'll take a PY from OO.
Right. So never mind the fact that we can obviously reform prison systems in some way. Currently, one of the issues with the CJS in general is the sentencing process that makes certain things crimes when they ought not be. In your world, why is there any incentive to reform these kinds of sentencing processes?
No, don't never mind it. CEO raise it as a POI. But beyond that, I also want to point out it is our side that makes these laws substantially less bad because it is harder for politicians to make money off of putting people in hats and then putting them into simulations. It's far harder to extract digital labor from these individuals than the physical labor of making appliances and then paying these people dirt cheap wages in prisons. So realistically speaking, the private prisons and the problem of the prison industrial complex to influence this legislation gets far worse. But beyond that, you can't never mind it. It is substantially easier to reform prisons on our side. Lastly, we also think rehabilitation is far more likely to be successful. One, prisoners simply feel more hope and are engaged in the rehabilitation process. They feel like there's a world ready for them when they exit this prison, that after the 100 years or the 50 years that they spend in prison, they can still come out a young man, a young woman, and change their life for the better. Beyond that, secondly, it means that they can reintegrate into society seamlessly. They can meet their friends. They can go back to their home and not find cobwebs in the corner of their bedroom. They can come home and feel human again, because realistically speaking, this is what the current prison system has taken away from these individuals. Any other alternative is inhumane. We are proud to propose.
Thank you for that fine speech. Elo, the floor is yours whenever you're ready. Here.
Hello, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Cool, give me a moment. Right, starting in 3, 2, 1. The first thing I want to do is just establish a policy that I think takes out a lot of what the Gov has to say. The first thing I want to note is that obviously we are likely on our side of the house to believe in the continuation of trends towards structural rehabilitation. That means, for example, you believe in the Scandinavian system, for example, for low-level criminals that aims to rehabilitate them and minimize punishment onto incredibly low-level criminals as much as possible. We also suggest that we're likely to commit money towards retraining prisoners instead of programs like the ICE that we don't think are particularly useful. More pertinently, I think what we want to note is that in a world where you have this much money for a simulation and the money to maintain this simulation over the long term, because this kind of technology is unlikely to run cheap, it is likely to be the case that we also have a decent amount of money to improve the situation within prisons. I think that looks like more guards and resources existing on our side of the house. I think that looks like better check and balance mechanisms being created by bureaucracy to oversee these prisons in order to ensure that the worst excesses are less likely to occur. This looks like better rehabilitation programs that actually allow you to keep up with society. The OG case says the status quo is bad. They do nothing to tell you why the status quo is always going to stay bad, even in a world where this much money could be pumped in. So I don't think that a lot of their case is particularly relevant. I'm going to run 2 extensions that deal with the rest of what they have to say. The first is why I think this perverts justice. The second is why I think this is fundamentally horrible for rehabilitation on that side of the house. Sure.
Yeah, if you want a counterprop, you need to prove it takes the same resources. You just assert this is very expensive, but it actually requires significantly fewer resources because you don't have prisons. So you need to prove why your alternatives are feasible and not just assert you can have them.
Yeah, I can do this lame debating thing. I tell you how much the technology costs and weigh it against real life. The reality, in my opinion, is that we should assume this costs a lot of money to create, a lot of money to run. And even if it doesn't correlate perfectly, I think the reality is that once you get the system right, it similarly means that it runs on its own significantly better than a world where you keep trying to fix problems. So I suppose that also means that a short-term solve creates long-term benefit. Like if you want to run this, go for it, man, go for it. Yeah. Why do we think this perverts justice on your side of the house? There are two things to note. The first is that I think on that side of the house, it's likely that they are never going to be able to punish people fully on that side. The reason for this is I think on some level, the premise or the basis of the justice system is fundamentally retributive in nature. That's why, for example, we do restrict your freedom to see your family like 7 days a week, even though we might concede that it may be a better, like a more possibly rehabilitative world. The reason for this is twofold. The first is that the principle of justice is ultimately to emulate what people do, like at least approximate what people conceptualize of as justice. And the reason for that is our conceptions of justice are socially constructed in the first place. That's why, for example, we have pillars of justice on the basis of what individuals believe. The reality, therefore, is that insofar as a crime is done onto society, i.e. society takes a loss in terms of security, in terms of the right to property, because of your crime, there is some need to repay this for repayment to exist. Why do I think that this repayment has to be done in terms of the loss of time, at least on some level? The reality is twofold. The first is that I think the problem on that side of the house is that what you take away at the point you commit a crime is real world, right? The trauma that is inflicted and the loss of security is likely to affect you for the long term as a victim. The loss of your property and needing to rebuild from that is something that affects you in reality. The concept of something that is simulated is not going to be commensurate in that regard. But the second thing to note is that I think society is never going to be able to see this as commensurate punishment for the reason that they don't have that experience or have nothing in life to approximate the experience of being simulated in a reflection mode, but not actually lose time at all or anything tangible in reality. That means society is unlikely to sympathize fully with the degree to which you are a rehabilitated individual or you are an individual who has gone through punishment and repaid their debt to society. The implication of this is that I think justice fails on its premise to be fair to victims. And I think insofar as these victims in the status quo see their ability to personally gain closure for their crimes outside the justice system on the premise that the justice system will do it for them. I'll take you in a while, David. I think therefore that there is a fundamental principle flaw in the justice system that they propose. But second, I also think that this leads to individuals actually taking things into their own hands. We're looking at things like vigilantism so that they can feel like closure actually exists. We're looking at things like the willingness to see prisoners as having paid their dues decreasing, which means the degree of stigma increases because you continue to see the prisoner as someone who owes a debt to the rest of society. That's, I think, problematic on that side. But the second thing I think is that society is likely to dramatically increase sentences on that side of the house. The reason for this is that society views this as insufficient, but as a result, in order to come closer to an idea of sufficiency, but also because they don't think this is a significant cost, they're unlikely to see long sentences as a major problem on that side of the house. What this means is they are likely to get longer sentences for individuals, and to the degree that they want to run that this is going to be sufficient to be a punishment, that means that punishments are unfairly and disproportionately punishing on that side. The problem is therefore that I think one, this doesn't actually achieve your end goal of rehabilitation because you keep them there longer than you have to, and that is good for them, or they would believe is proportional for their sentence. But second, I also think that this worsens the sentencing process because the structural inequalities in the system that will continue to hurt minorities disproportionately. There is less incentive to solve this because you don't think that it's a big problem. Their claim is that it's because that politicians won't be captured. This ignores all the other incentive structures like crime, like running on law and safety platforms, for example, or wanting to feel like in a safe society that also exists to be harsh on prisoners. David.
Your point on victims feeling aggrieved is nonsensical. Like, it literally might be our side that lets them see the footage of a full rehabilitation process where like your side might die before the prison term ends. Like, your side shows that any rehabilitation isn't likely because victims feel so angry about things.
I'm going to go on to explain why you don't get rehabilitation, but more pertinently, I think the question then is about sentencing guidelines that are more likely to solve on our side. Second, why do I think this is horrible for rehabilitation? I want to give them the best case scenario realistic simulations, right? To be fair to the OG. The problem is that this is essentially Captain America in reverse, right? You're an 80-year-old man coming back into a 30-year-old body and trying to survive. The problem is that is fundamentally means that as you've grown older in prison, you have a whole different set of life experiences that don't actually match the way that real life has not progressed, whereas you as an individual have progressed. We're talking about the fact that you age and mellow and the way in which you see the world changes the longer you're in the world and the more life experiences you have, even if they're simulated life experiences within the sim. We're talking about the fact that you have loneliness within prison because you don't actually have family members, for example, who are there to take care of you on that side of the house. So because you can age the family members in that way. The problem is that on that side, they then want you to come back to normal, right? And the problem then is you have a fundamental inability to reintegrate because the way in which society expects you to behave is completely different from the way in which you behave. The way in which your experiences with your support networks and your close loved ones are function are fundamentally different. I know they're going to say, but prison changes you as well. Here's the difference, right? One, I think we are able to change the, at least when you come out, we are at an age where we recognize and accept the way in which you are. But second, and more importantly, we're able to tailor rehabilitation programs to allow for this change to be factored in. Three, I also think that things like family members adapt to you as you age, and therefore that means that they're in a better position to give them this support structure on that side of the house. The problem is that the way in which David runs the claim on rehabilitation assumes that the only problem is society moving on, and you can't move on with society, but you moving on in ahead of society is a lot worse because there's nothing we can do to change that, because that's inherently the fact that society is not going to change for you. That is why we propose.
So much for that excellent speech. DPM, the floor is yours whenever you're ready. Here.
Hello, testing a microphone. Can I be heard properly?
Loud.
All right, thank you. POIs in the chat. I'll watch the chat as much as possible, and then I'll start my speech in a moment. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, and go. So there are 5 things I'm going to run in the speech. Number 1, why this model costs less money. Number 2, why the mental torture and the degree and suffering is significantly mitigated and safeguarded in our world. And number 3, why physical pain and the physical prison reform incentives fail. Number 4, why this is likely to, why our model still restores trust in the criminal justice system. And lastly, I'm going to talk about, even if they have a perfect prison system, the aging and time is something we'll never give up in this speech. Firstly, why our model costs less money? Because again, the model in OP is obviously idealistic, and obviously they need to prove as to why they require the same resources as us. Our model requires significantly less money, and therefore, to the degree that they want to have more and more reforms, it's very, very costly, and it's not going to be the same fiat. Number 1, obviously, this model is different because you're funding the funding of a significant technology that is it's easier to do this because you need to stop funding different for construction of hundreds and billions of dollars worth of different prisons across the world. That's prohibitively more expensive as more prisoners increase. Number 2, funding from research and development also increases economies of scale for this technology, so that the entertainment industry, maybe Iron Man might want to use this technology too, so it's very, very cheap and very, very easy and very accessible for them to use this. But lastly, there's just less upkeep and less maintenance for them to do this because of the fact it's very short term compared to the long-term investments in rehabilitation, or more and more time to spend on beds, on more and more time to spend on hospital structures and healthcare systems for every single prison in Scandinavia or everywhere across the world, for you to try and make sure every prison becomes more and more adaptive to that needs. This just doesn't work on their model. Number 2, why does mental torture and the degree of suffering significantly get mitigated in our world and safeguarded in our side? So I want to respond to closing opposition and the harms as to why there are incentives as to why this is not going to be as extreme as they painted out to be. 3 things. Number 1, and to make it comparative as possible, I want to spin their political incentive point. The reason as to why there is a political incentive now to exaggerate and to over-punish and be overly retributive against prisoners today is that old prisoners have no political say. Most prisoners have no political say. They cannot vote. But young prisoners that spend 2 days to be able to go through this process can still be productive and meaningful in society and be able to contribute significant swaths of productivity to our nation. They are a significant voting population. So they'll still be able to vote, meaning that their political calculus will still be integrated with the rest of society, and means that compared to the vast majority of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of prisoners that cannot vote in the status quo for many years in their world, they're never going to have the political say and bargaining power and bargaining chip to be able to shift political incentives of politicians. Number 2, the corporations, or at least the comparative, is worse in their model because they have both mental suffering and physical suffering that happens with the experience of abuses and the experience of literally feeling like you are having more age-related diseases or mental health problems as you are socially conditioned within a prison that you cannot approximate or safeguard within a controlled, simulated environment. Obviously, in our model, we try as much as possible to protect this for most prisoners because you want them to still be productive and meaningful and be able to be good people in society that will not conduct your crimes again in the future. But lastly, if anything, there are more incentives to make this as safe as possible and as mentally good as possible for these prisoners, because you don't want them to commit crimes again. So the long-term perspective and long-term political incentives still shift in our world, and therefore they are better. The next thing I want to respond to then is why physical prison reform initiatives and incentives fail, to respond to Shermay's POI. A few things I want to say here. Number one, old people are unproductive and are not within the political calculus of prisoners and prisons and politicians. Number two, physical construction of more private prisons is very, very profitable, because obviously, like, you want as much as possible to reduce the marginal cost of you constructing more prisons and putting in more and more over congested individuals and prisons into these places. Therefore, the cost of this money is very, 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 very profitable for many of these private corporations and the prison industrial complex, and they collude with many politicians now to do so. So the same symmetric profit incentive does not exist with these simulated prisons and simulated environments, because you just have to, give money to Elon Musk or something, or whoever makes this technology. Number two, the parole system actually encourages more prisons to give, for more prisoners to give up in prison. So remember, Shawshank Redemption, hope is a good thing. It's sometimes the best of things with many of people that you love. The time and age they spend in prison really does add to the hopelessness that they feel, especially when they can really feel themselves age in a real world setting, and they know that they can never change things that they've done in the past, even if it was a slight mistake in the past. At least now, yes, they experience a fully real world, but when they wake up, they know that now they can recompense and make amends for these changes, and that's why it's better in our world. The last thing I want to respond to then is this argument on the loss of trust in the system. And they say society won't change, they'll not adapt to you, and it's going to be worse. A few things. Number one, retribution still exists in our world, because number one, if it is still filled, then there are still incentives as to why they're, you want to fulfill their sentence, and they don't want to die inside a prison, and sometimes victims don't feel that was enough because they just died very early on. Or number two, our recidivism likely decreases, and therefore people are more willing to participate and cooperate with the system. And lastly, people still grow in wisdom in a virtual world, and therefore the mindset still changes, but the norms in society and how they also adjust to this can also change as well, especially when they know that the virtual simulation is very, very effective for most prisoners. I think it's very, very effective in convincing people.
So on your side of the house, if it is true that individuals will forget that all prison sentences are in fact a simulation and believe that they are going through a real prison sentence, isn't the trauma of that sentence and the resentment that they will feel exactly the same on your side?
Yeah. So my response there was, if the trauma is the same, then at least there's no physical damage, and therefore it's better. So that's the worst case. I want to talk about the best case on opposition now. There wasn't a POI from CO, so don't, it's not a significant flaw yet. All right. So assuming they have a perfect prison system, what changes? Changes is aging and time. That is the controlled thing. That is the delta in this debate. Aging and time is very, very bad for most prisoners. A few things to note here. Number one, the relationships that you make, the social conditioning that you have with other people, the habits that you have with your family, the disconnections you have with most people. Opposition, they agree they want to forgo this for most individuals and prisoners in society. That is actually significantly worse when also those old people and their family members also give up on you, and they stop visiting you in prison, and they're never gonna try and repair your relationships, because who wants to go back to Uncle Johnny when that dude is already 80 years old and he's already spent 40 years in jail? No one's gonna go back to that dude. But secondly, like, more arthritis, health-related diseases, these things are worse for more people. We don't like that. That really hurts them. More expenses. It just makes their life less unhappy. Very proud to propose.
Thank you for that fine speech. DLO, the floor is now yours. Here.
Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
All right, amazing, thanks. I'm going to deal with this debate in two ways. One, I'm going to explain why all the peripheral issues that OG attempts to frame out of this debate by focusing only on the disproportionality of prison sentences actually ignores the kind of crucial reforms that society needs in order for us to progress in terms of a moral understanding of the criminal justice system. Two, I'm going to explain why actually the thing that they think is a benefit, i.e. aging and loss of life, is actually something that is fundamental to our ability to understand what it means to pay for a crime that you have committed. One, why disproportionality is not an argument in this debate. I'll give it to the OG. I think they set it up fairly beautifully. But actually, this is, I think, a false isolation of reality. Why? One, I think with regards to the way in which policies are made by states, the principle through which we ought to organize ourselves is not to take on all the harms of a simulation because it responds to specifically state failure as opposed to state policy, which means that as long as the principle of a prison sentence is one in which we are moving towards one that is more humane, we're moving towards one in which people should be treated equally and should be treated with more dignity than the one that we currently have, then the inequalities of the prison system is a problem of failure, not a problem of policy, which means that your argument, unless you can prove that there is no possibility whatsoever to ever reform the system in a way that reduces things like sexual assault, does not apply. But crucially, I want to make the casual observation that many countries in the world have prison systems that work. Singapore, Scandinavian countries, many developed countries, unlike the US, actually are able to do this, which therefore suggests that the OG case does not apply to a number of countries in which this policy is merely a regression of what the principles are that we care about in a way that we think is inherently problematic. Thirdly, the duties and obligations of the state is meant to create fair and good prison systems. And the point here is they only give you two reasons why this cannot happen. One, the amount of resources that happen. And I hate this part of debating because even if I could give you actual numbers, it's not like I'm going to buy anyway. So can we just assume that there is a way in which this could potentially be done? But secondly, the idea of the prison industrial complex and the like. Look, these practical considerations can be worked on, but they are not inherent problems of the system. To the extent to which, for instance, we recognize that there are growing political incentives outside that are affected by the recognition that prison systems are fucked up. This also means that there are political incentives towards doing things like reducing sentences for drug crimes or other crimes that ought not put people through a disproportionate system. There's greater awareness of the problems of what it means for rehabilitation, which also incurs greater discursive experience of what it means for individuals to actually genuinely be able to repent for a crime, the conditions that are required for them to know that they have done something wrong, and the ability for them to become more integrated citizens in the future. These are benefits, and these are the kinds of external considerations that their side gives up for the sake of solving what is inherently a failure of the application of policy, not a principal problem of policy. Let's go a little bit more into the problems of what is actually inherent for the government. One, sentencing right now is extremely problematic, which means that people have things like prison records that exist regardless of the amount of time that they spend in prison, which obviously dissociates them from the capacity to have equal opportunity later in life. But secondly, oftentimes for socioeconomically poor individuals, the trial process in which they cannot post bail, for instance, also introduces inequality in the ways in which they're able to live their lives, which means that on the side of the government, to the extent to which this is an easy and cheap policy as they prescribe for people to be able to be sentenced to jail, the sentencing procedure and the kind of political incentive and capital that you have to say that people should not be thrown into jail for things like this just disappears, and we think you ruin our capacity to have a better moral understanding of things that ought to be punished. Yes, CG.
If you were going to prison for 10 years, you now get 10 years of your life back. We think that years of life are very, very valuable. As an intuition, killing someone 10 years early is a terrible thing. Why isn't that the most important benefit?
Okay, fantastic. That segues me right into this, so I don't have to waste time answering a POI. I mean, not that it's a waste of time, it's an important argument, but I'm actually going to talk about it. One, I think prison sentences actually become worse. So to the extent to which you care about the quality of what that prison is like, we think that the way political incentives skew themselves is now that because there is no actual time lost, the way that people conceptualize the prison sentences radically shifts. No, that is not just about forced labor, but people genuinely believe that prisoners ought not have political capital and ought not have rights because they are a scourge on society, which means that because you aren't giving up on life, the political capital that is used right now is meant towards actually the only way in which people now believe that they can be protected from crimes being committed in the future is through greater deterrence. That deterrence translates itself into the harshest possible sentences for individuals within that simulation, which we think only augments the trauma and turns away from greater discourses that we have towards more rehabilitative means through which we are able to carry out prison sentences. Oji goes, no, but at least we can not make in sexual assault. Look, that's a simplification of the debate, because there are ways in which you can make life significantly worse for people. And the idea of an ideal prison sentence is actually something that's quite up for debate, in that if we presumably care about rehab, we would not put you in things like solitary confinement. We would not put you in things like small cells. But if we think that we need to stop you from committing a crime and there's no other deterrent force, then we will do these things to you. Yes, Oji.
Look, you can't have nice Scandinavian prisons that stray away from harming people in the name of deterrence, but also increase prison sentences to absurdly long because people are so involved in deterrence. Which one is it and why?
No, I'm saying that the long prison sentences is a problem you have to solve. And on our side, we have these causes that suggest that because there's a real prison and a real cause, you can have those kinds of better prison systems on our side. Next, why do we think that this is actually important when it comes to why aging is not actually a benefit on their side? The first thing that I would note is that they never respond to the arguments that Shaun gives you. And I think that time is actually something that you can't just re-implement into individuals. Just on the basis of, life experience and the like, if your AI is really true, you just can't reintegrate. And oftentimes the shock of seeing your family again when you believe they have died and the like creates massive psychological trauma for individuals. But I would just make the casual observation as well that now that I am like old and shit and 26, I look at time very differently from the way that I did when I was 20, because just things like, for example, the mental experience that you have makes you value each individual experience and time very differently. So you can't actually meaningfully reintegrate into your society. We think that this is massive emotional trauma for these individuals. But secondly, often people form communities within jails because of the common experiences that they've had. This does not exist on their side, in which you are alone in the kind of trauma that you have suffered. But lastly, they never responded to Shaun's principal argumentation that oftentimes part of the retributive aspect is that you have to give up something, is to give up life. It's not about killing you. You have an experience in prison. But the point here is we are taking away that part of your life and reconstituting that experience because you have committed a crime to society. We think those things are parts of our consideration of justice that we ought to keep up. We are very happy to oppose.
Thank you for that fine speech. That brings us to the end of the opening half of the debate. Member Gov, the floor is yours when you're ready. Here.
I'll take POIs by asking people to turn on their videos and wave. I'll also take them if you unmute yourself and say POI, but the TLDR is I never look at the chat. I think Shirming's observation that the OG case takes place quite unreasonably in the absolute worst case of prisons across the world is very legitimate. And also that she is also right that there is a progression in the status quo, which is the worst harms of abusers are probably marginal. OG had a bigger burden to prove uniqueness. That said, our extension is going to be why in every single prison cell across the world, the biggest harm to prisoners is the fact that when you get to jail, you lose 10, 20, 30 years of your life that you're never going to get back. And that's a principal harm that outweighs everything else in the round. Before I get into that, and I'll do a lot of engagement within the argument too, I just want to first take out a large thrust that I think depends on in order to not for in the round, right? Which is the idea that in the counterfactual, things get better, and in our world, things get worse because sentences become longer, because you can't post bail, all of these structural things. Two main reasons why OO's harm of regression doesn't happen. The first is because I generally overestimate how people are going to react to this. Because my intuition in seeing this motion was that this was quite dystopian, quite scary, right? Because you're experiencing 10 years of your life pass by, I think just very, very intuitively, especially the category of conservative boomers who they're talking about are going to feel like this is significant punishment. Second of all, though, I think if they observe that in the status quo, there is a positive trend towards being more empathetic towards prisoners, it's deeply unclear why the very moment you put in simulations, this goes 180 and you lose that trend of progression in their side. Worst case scenario, the trajectory of positive change on our side slows. We still think our benefits outweigh. DJ, I'll take you after this rebuttal. And finally, I just think that even if people are pissed off and there's backlash, that doesn't actually reach them to the barrier of having longer sentences. Why? Because there's an uphill battle against years of bureaucracy, right? AKA, there's established precedent that the punishment for a murder or a punishment for a sexual assault is X number of years under Y conditions. And I think that the judicial system will push back extremely aggressively when conservative people protest this. But the second reason is just because I don't think that the narrative that even the most hardcore law and order people use is that prisoners are evil, they should be punished as much as possible, because I think increasingly people are pushing back the death sentence, as they say. For example, the narrative that they use to justify extreme harm is a scarcity of resources, and that people who have committed harm don't deserve extra care and attention like we do. There's no reason why you would just pointlessly increase the sentence in their case. Is that a POI?
Yep.
Go.
When is a person likely to feel more sympathetic for you? When you say that you were bullied as a child, or that you had multiple nightmares that you were bullied as a child?
Honestly, I think the determining factor is not whether or not you're telling them that you were bullied as a child, or whether or not you had nightmares about being bullied as a child. It's whether or not you are close to that person personally, and therefore understand them, like them, and feel empathy towards them. I think that's why there's really no delta in terms of empathy on your side. But the second impact is, I honestly think it's evil to be like, this is bad because when you make life better for prisoners, or that means that there's less sympathy for their plight and get less change, we shouldn't use individual suffering and honestly as a battering ram to achieve social change very intuitively. Okay, now into my extension, right? Which is just that the status quo is incredibly principally unjustified. OG says a bunch of harm and frames as state obligation, but this is really a one-liner. Outside the narrow context, the worst prison in the world, I'm gonna acknowledge that O has valid claims on how victims do matter and explain why, despite these ideas, we should prioritize simulations. The first is just, let's consider the framework for when we imprison people, right? It's not retributive for a couple of reasons. One, we do it to protect people from people while they're unsafe and dangerous, but two, we rehabilitate people because both we want to care about that person getting their life back, but also for the sake of keeping future victims safe. Why is this? And note panel that even now that I'm like 30 seconds in my extension, this already puts us above OG, who just say that prison is retributive. 3 reasons why it's not. The first is because the vast majority of people are undeserving of prison. As O observes, people get into jail on false charges because of drug crimes, victimless crimes, because of racial bias in the system. But 2, intuitively, suffering is extremely bad and we shouldn't make it worse in order to punish someone for it. But third of all, just really intuitively, I think that people reject the idea that we should punish people for the sake of punishing people when it's applied to someone who's close to them. A friend or a family member into jail, for example, a heartbreaking act. If you feel empathy for it, you need to accept that it's bad. So I also just want to observe that Jeremy's idea of deterrence is really dumb for a couple of reasons. One, people who commit crimes for socioeconomic reasons do this for survival because they have no other choice. But 2, people who commit crimes of passion or violence often do so because they assume they won't be caught. So I don't think that the length of the prison sentence or this will have a meaningful change at all. Why then does the status quo cross this bar of basic standards? Because I think it unacceptably restricts your freedom and you're paying for a crime not just by being protected from the rest of society, but by paying for it with actual years of your life. The intuition is this: imagine somebody commits a crime at age 50 and then sits in jail for 20 years. The question then is whether or not upon release you immediately die as a 20-year-old, or if you come out of jail at 70, then you have 20 more years of your life as a 90-year-old to re-experience the world, to redeem yourself, to basically be a human being again outside of the constraints of prison. I'll explain why this is important, but before that, I'll take OO.
Yep, Xiao-ke. So the reality is that the premise of the justice system, as we proved in our speeches and I gave actual reasons for, is that you commit a crime into society, and that crime justifies the retributive nature of punishing you. In a world where you think that justice is entirely rehabilitative, why wouldn't you just adjust the sentence to the point of rehabilitation?
Yeah, fantastic. We would love to do that, but we can't explain that this immediately happens But second of all, also just really intuitively, the fucking prison sentence is your punishment. Being put in a fucking jail cell for like 30 years is a huge prison sentence. Doesn't mean you should die immediately afterwards. Okay, now onto why this is the most important impact in the round. The first reason is because humans are really resilient, right? People are able to recover from trauma. People are able to marry again and have new children after they lose a loved one. The controlling factor for their happiness is time and freedom and whether or not they have the time to make all of these decisions. But second of all, because just really intuitively, it's heartbreaking for someone to have their lives torn away and redefined because of one mistake they made in their youth. Finally, explicitly, why does this outweigh OG? Because we outweigh on scale, because this applies to millions of prisoners in China, millions of prisoners in the USA, millions of prisoners even in Scandinavian countries, and that outweighs the question of we should care about the most number of people alleviating their suffering. But second of all, because the harms that we get from top half are both marginal. They're marginal increases in time, they're marginal differences in quality of life. Luigi literally says the marginal difference is physical harm. I think for those reasons, we have the most important impact in the round. Please vote CG.
Thank you for that fine speech. Member Ock, the floor is yours when you're ready. Here.
Great. I'll take POIs either in the chat or feel free to wave at me. Punishment is not just the 10 years you spent in prison, but it's the 10 years afterward for which you are on the streets, for which you cannot find a job, for which you are excluded from society, and you are pushed down by the state that does not give you adequate support systems. The argument on closing government is deeply uncomparative because you lose time in your life and you lose the ability to actually pursue things that are valuable for yourself on either side, at the point at which we'll explain that the way in which you reintegrate and the way in which you actually are able to come back in society becomes much, much worse. What the opening half of the debate showed you was that prison sentences are broadly bad. Look, at the end of the opening half, as far as a lot of it is a wash in terms of why prison sentences might get longer on opening opposition, but they are on net shorter in terms of the amount of time to take out of your life. That largely is a wash. But the thing that changes uniquely is how society is likely to treat you afterward, how able you are to reintegrate. And that leads to massive amounts of harm, meaning you are punished anyways for 10 to 20 years, even if the actual amount of time in the simulation is exceptionally short. We'll explain in extension why this absolutely removes state support for convicts after conviction. And this also removes things like community acceptance, which is absolutely critical. Before that, I want to engage with government. Let's start with opening gov, where they talk about mostly about physical, real-world prisons leading to abuse. I want to note that the premise of opening government is blatantly false here, where I think they try to frame this as abuse in badly funded prisons only happen because it's really, really hard to create good prisons, or just it's really, really difficult to do this, so these are a necessary evil and we just can't stop prison guards. I think this premise is blatantly false insofar as the problem isn't that the government doesn't have enough control and that this is infeasible. The problem is that governments are often, when they can be, harsh on crime and often just ignorant or willingly harsh on crime towards prisoners. Because notably, there are lots of common sense things that states could be doing to try and make these conditions better. Things like body cams on each of their staff, things like prosecuting individual people who are extremely harsh on prisoners. But these are things they don't do, particularly because they are harsh on crime. And I think that is a thing that's likely to continue under their side anyways. I think that more abuse is likely under the simulation also, because firstly, injuries are literally temporary. There is just no evidence of them happening. They literally fade away over time. So there isn't actually meaningful harm in doing them. But also in a physical prison, you can do things like discipline specific guards for being abusive. You cannot do that when this is literally simulation and there wasn't a specific perpetrator. So those are all reasons why abuse is significantly more likely on OG's side. In terms of CG, their argument of time, I think, is deeply uncomparative, and we'll explain why the time that you suffer is actually elevated on their side. So firstly, why does this massively remove support for convicts after prison, which is the thing that people need irrespective of the jail sentence that they serve? This is important. I'll establish the significance of this argument first. Why is it absolutely significant that you get state support and things like community acceptance? Because firstly, even in government's world, you always need significant support from the state after prison sentences to reintegrate. Why? One, because most people who commit crimes before and after the crime are still in situations of social or economic deprivation and often commit crimes or lead to things like recidivism because of a lack of redress of those conditions, or things like unaddressed health issues because of a lack of proper health systems. But furthermore, even if you give someone a horrid sentence for 2 days, that means that they often still struggle after they are released critically, because it's not just that prison de-skills you, but that you didn't have those skills to begin with. But thirdly, it's also just because the real reason that people needed help after prison is because it is a deeply traumatizing experience, one where you lose the ability to interact in normal society and do things like give a job interview, like interact with others. You lose the mental stability to deal with with things like adversity. You often come out with other mental health issues just because of the fact of being in that prison experience mentally, meaning you were often unable to reintegrate. What this means is that even after prison, regardless of how nice the prison is or how short the thing is, you need significant state support. Things like skills training programs, things like job matching programs that give you things like matching to jobs that are suitable for your skills, that subsidize things like your travel, like subsidize things like psychiatry programs that help you reintegrate. But also community acceptance is absolutely important, given that these are communities that know you. These are communities that often know these offenders and are deeply hurt by them. What matters is whether or not local businesses are willing to hire you, whether or not people are going to accept you after the fact. We think there's 3 structural reasons people are unlikely to do so. Firstly, because communities have no time to heal whatsoever. This means that you are much more likely as a community to accept an individual when you have like the time to forgive and forget and actually be able to come to terms with that as a community, rather than when this person comes back to your community within 3 days and people still feel unsafe by their physical presence there. Number 2, because what opening opposition critically misses about this argument is that in the status quo, people often are harsh on crime, but the reason why they are able to be mitigated, or the reason why we're able to mitigate those desires, is because of the fact that we know that a prison system actually destroys your life and destroys you, given that it takes away the many years of time that CG talks about. But thirdly, Republicans often spend, and like people who are the most harsh on crime are often people who are more conservative and those who hate spending extra costs where necessary. So if they think that you don't need things like post-conviction rehabilitation programs as much, they're less likely to want to spend money on it. That's also a huge harm, given that those things are likely to decrease. What changes under their side then? And before I move on, I'll take a POI from opening.
So we've already outframed most of these benefits, like this costs less resources to implement these programs, you spend less time alienated and away from the community, and your life is comparatively less destroyed. Like even if there's less incentive, there's also less of a threshold to meet in the first place.
So this misses a lot of the arguments, given that firstly, we already explained why people see these programs as less necessary and communities feel less safe, meaning they're less likely to push for these types of programs that are altruistic for the people. So what actually changes that's really, really harmful? I want to be clear. Firstly, this is absolutely terrible for victims ever reporting crimes. Like, think about if you are a victim and you know that the person you are reporting a crime against will literally be back in your community in 3 days' time. That massively has a chilling effect that's unlikely to mean that victims are ever going to feel comfortable interacting with the justice system, meaning this has a future effect on all future victims, which you ought to care about. But secondly, this massively affects how communities interact with inmates. 1, they're less likely to ever hire inmates after the fact, meaning these individuals are always more likely to have to recidivism, but they're also more likely to have communities take justice into their own hands. Closing government, go ahead.
We agree that communities are the more important support structures, that random strangers aren't going to go out of their way to support you, even if they've forgotten you 30 years later. The most important support is your family and whether or not they've moved away from you after you've spent 20 years in jail.
This is blatantly false for the other reasons that are already presented in the extension, insofar as, firstly, these are communities that often literally know you and like you are employed by businesses in these same communities after you come out, but also things like state support. So the things that change in communities is, firstly, they're literally unlikely to ever accept you in social circles. They're literally unlikely to hire you, meaning you are stuck in those same cycles that lead you to be more likely to commit crime. But secondly, things like vigilante justice committed by that community that also lead to additional punishment when they think that you have not been punished enough. But finally, it's things like state support that diminish and diminish and diminish over time. The fact that the state is less willing to provide money insofar as it's seen as unnecessary because you haven't served a large amount of time, so you are seen as less willing, as needing those things like employment programs. This is the most important consideration in the debate for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because OWOC talks about just like you are likely to have just a longer mental experience in this prison, but they don't actually explain why this leads to tangible more punishment for you. We explain this leads to a massive amount of future crimes, both because victims are unable to report, but also because those offenders are always punished for multiple decades after their sentence by the communities they enter and by the state that is uncaring for them. For all those reasons, things get worse for offenders and victims. We oppose.
Thank you for that fine speech. Now to summarize the case on side government, Gov Whip the case. The floor is yours. Here.
POIs in the chat, please. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. First thing I'll do is respond to closing opposition. Our impact is basically if your life sentence was X years, you live X years longer, or the state doesn't kill you X years early, because that's what they do under the status quo. They claim that people might suffer economic hardship as a consequence of this policy. If you think about any case where these trade off, the government always prioritizes avoiding taking away people's life. And I think it's an intuition we broadly share, right? Like when we decide, for instance, We don't kill one person over another because this person is slightly better off. We don't think that questions about how wealthy you are or your quality of life come into play when we evaluate whether or not people lie. So at best, I don't think they beat our claims. But secondly, I think these are widely implausible. And I think the way to talk about this is separate them into two circumstances. The first is non-violent criminals who maybe in the worst case commit fraud, but in many cases don't have victims who suffer immense psychological trauma. This is the vast majority of prisoners around the world. These people in most cases won't have huge numbers of victims that are unable to move on, or communities that are massively devastated by them, and are therefore relatively likely to be reintegrated into society anyway, and this has a minor harm. With respect to the claim that you want them to feel that they've overcome something, it is largely an assertion from the op side that people don't buy that you've overcome things. I think the only plausible mechanism is on victim trauma, and there aren't victims. With respect to violent criminals, these people under their side go to jail for 10, 15 years and lose the majority of their lives anyway, so it's not clear why this is work, but also never get hired anyway. If you commit a murder, you don't go back to the village you came from, and people don't give you a job, even if you've spent 15 years in prison. This seems very, very minor. In their best case, it's perception that it's destroyed your life, right? But this doesn't overcome the fact that everyone sees you as a terrible person, and being in prison makes you unhireable because everyone thinks you joined the gang, and even worse than when you went in. So it's not clear they get any solvency under their side in the worst case. But finally, why do these people go back to the same communities, right? Like, everyone hates you. You don't want to be known for the rest of your life as the person that did the terrible thing. And that's probably the thing that will be most likely to affect this. So your incentive is probably to move to another big city with your family, to reconstruct your life and hope that people don't figure out who you are. And in that case, most of the victim harms are reversed anyway, and consequently, most of their unique mechanisms for change. On our impact, the impact is as follows. They age in prison under their side, and they do not on our side. What this means is that when you come out, you have 10, 20 years of your life left that weren't taken away from you in light of the fact that you aged while in prison. This is massively, massively valuable because if you think, right, at the point when people exit prison, we perceive them as having overcome what they've done that is bad, and therefore people that don't deserve to suffer. And therefore our general intuitions that not dying early is very, very important. But secondly, XK also tells you that these people in many cases are not guilty, and those are the people that we should prioritize in most instances. In which case the question is, right, if someone were enslaved for 20 years, which is, I guess, the closest analogy we have for what prison entails, do we think that afterwards they deserve to live an extra 10 years? Obviously, that is the impact that we're dealing with under our side. I think that given that valuing life is literally the preeminent moral philosophy of literally any religion, any world, like any society you can think of, this is what you have to vote for, because we do the single largest harm to prisoners under their side of the house. Let's weigh this against OG's claims, because they talk about aging. They say one family, which I think OO clashes because it explains how you probably dissociate with the family anyway. But secondly, is clearly less important because, again, I think we don't make evaluations about whether or not you have support systems or even how happy you are when we've decided upon the value of individual people's life. The second thing they say is that you're a little bit old, which is odd because it's symmetric, given under our side people age earlier. The question is whether or not we give them the 10 years when they're young, which is clearly a much better impact than OGs. OO tries to come against this by saying the extra years are not worth your life. They say that you have psychological trauma and your communities have abandoned you. I've already explained as a point of framing why these are not sufficient to overcome the impact, but I'd like to notice that they are symmetric. That is, these harms are incurred anyway because you still spend 10 instead of 20 years in prison, and it's not clear what the extra psychological damage or extra isolation from your community does. The question is whether these are so bad that they make your life not worth living. That is a terrible principle for them to stand behind, and I don't think they want to.
So political capital isn't stagnant on either side of the house. In your world, if it is true that there are such massive benefits that are attendant to this simulation, then presumably all the sentencing problems and the fact that the simulation might be problematic and harmful would therefore exist, and you can't run away from those kinds of trade-offs.
Okay, so OO says sentence regression. XK gives a number of responses, that is to say psychological trauma, and there's a trend towards progressiveness. OO says that the reason it's unique is that you can't tell what this suffering is like with respect to other suffering. This makes no sense because you know what the feeling of being as a prisoner is like equally under both sides. So the question is whether this like being in a simulation is uniquely meaningful. And not clear why it's not, because you know for certain these people perceive this and you can compare it to other things that you perceive that suggest this is symmetric. CO has this kind of odd example of a nightmare. I think there's other ways to explain this intuition. The fact that dreams are less vivid, the fact there's no agent and we tend to attribute more harm when there's agent. So I think sentences are probably minor, but even if not, one, our intuition is that it's worth to die than it is to go to prison, which means that people are happier in general to get the extra years of life for extra time in prison. How do we know this intuition exists? One, people appeal death penalties, which suggest they would prefer to be in prison than they would prefer to die. So the revealed preference of prisoners points in this direction. Secondly, in general, we have an intuition that the death penalty is wrong, but prison is okay, that again suggests we think the harm is worse under our side, that is taking away years of people's life, than it is on their side, that is giving them extra years in prison, so ours outweigh. Second, I'll take CO.
Pretty much all of the responsiveness in CG has already been dealt with the extension. You cannot move to another community when you do not have the money or resources to do so. And the only reason you would have these resources is often because of state support that subsidizes travel. It also doesn't deal with the psychological impact that make it difficult for you to get a job.
Okay, there's basically two impacts on their side. The fact the state doesn't want to support you, which is contingent on the characterization that they believe you've been punished less, which is largely an assertion in your case based on nightmare, or from local communities. Our claim is that that's probably insufficient to get you support anyway, but there are ways of mitigating this, and it's assertion you can't go to a nearby village, and the delineation by violent and non-violent offenders also sought back. Second weighing mechanism, I think the same harm is incurred on their side. Like the way we evaluate harm is average amount of time that the harm occurred for, times by the average harm. The average harm is on both sides, and on both sides you perceive per unit time that you're in prison, and you're doing this for 2 to 3 days anyway. So it's actually not clear that the impact changes based on the amount of time. The intuition here is like, if you take marijuana, you perceive that time travels more slowly, but we don't think that your life is more utile in that instance, right? So I don't think that the perception that time travels faster changes the amount of harm that happens on their side. Finally, in response to the retribution, the problem here, this is all fallacy. It makes the claim about the way the world is and asserts that's how it should be. We claim prisoners do not deserve to be punished. One, it is not clear that they did the crime in the sense that many of the cases they're falsely accused, or these things they're accused of, like being homosexual, are not real crimes. Two, unclear why free will exists or why people opt into this or why state failure doesn't coerce the vast majority of prisoners around the world. So the intuition is victims don't have a unique claim against this particular person that legitimizes crime because it's arbitrary who committed the crime in the first place. Proud to propose.
Thank you for that fine speech. Now to summarize the case on the opposition and indeed conclude the debate, the floor is yours. Here.
Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Cool. Okay. Let's get started in 3, 2, 1, go. First, I'm going to look at closing government. Then I'm going to talk about our extension, why it beats front half, and just every team in this round, and then a little bit more direct refutation to opening government. So on closing government, the keynote for this like reasonably derivative extension is essentially the idea that we should not be taking away years of your life. Guys, this is sort of like you're killing someone, and it's really unfair to put that onto people, and a bunch of reasons why, prisoners would rather not die. This really misses the current nature of when you actually give people significant sentences, okay? Because like they want to make you believe that, oh, isn't it really fucked up that you're giving 35 years and basically making it such that one small mistake when you were a kid now means that you are old when you are left back into society? This is not the justice system that, number one, exists in the vast majority of criminal justice systems, but number two also that will exist if you let these sentencing things moderate over time. What that means, though, is that their principle falls apart if you actually consider the cases where you're going to be put into prison for seriously long amount of times. Why? Because the justice system respects proportionality. It is simply, if you inflict significant pain and harm onto someone, it is legitimate for the state to inflict similar amounts of pain and harm back onto you. If you killed 4 people, it is legitimate, given the fact that you drained like so many years of life, for the state to take 20 years of your life away, even if this is real physical life that will bring you closer to death. Panel, this is literally sexual assaulters, people who run mob rings. This is not a kid who randomly sold drugs once and is now only being let out when he is 80. And that is a mischaracterization of how the justice system dispenses principles. This really deals with most of CJ's principled argument because it's about the proportionality. You have taken significant years of life often from a lot of people when you commit crimes that get you put into prison for that long. It is legitimate then for the reciprocal action to be committed onto you. It is something you consent into by consenting into attacking someone. And government believes this despite their last 20 seconds on what if there's no free will, because they're willing to throw people into simulation prisons. So they believe there is a onus on the state to punish people. This is proportional and hence it is legitimate. CG's extension just does not stand. Let's go on to what we told you in closing opposition. I want to point out the vast majority of this extension was not refuted. There are 3 parts of this extension that Eric brought up to you. The first was when he proved you will always need good state support in order to survive on both sides of the house. He told you how you never had skills in the first place, you lose social skills even in government's world, and you're likely depressed. What does this prove before we go any further? OG gives a POI where they say, oh, but we dealt with this already. We showed there's less of a need to give you these skill training programs because less has been taken for you. We break that premise. The idea that you actually don't need a significant amount of government investment in order to be healthy and come back into society is simply false. In fact, OG seems to believe that own rhetoric, which is why people are no longer going to want to fund any skill retraining program because Gov team themselves believes that, hey, you're young, you should be able to work. It was like a really bad time for 2 days, but you still have your skills, you're still in the workforce age, you should be able to integrate normally. Aging, we accept, is unique to our side and bad, but both sides require a significant amount of state infrastructure and policy in order to enable you to live a decent life. Notice that we are the side that cares about living a good quality of life when closing government just cares about preserving life for the sake of it as well. So why is this policy significantly lost on their side? Number one, because yes, you think people have been punished significantly less. Closing government says, oh, there's a trend to progressivism. And the feeling, you can imagine the feeling of being in prison. But here's the thing, you can't imagine the feeling of a simulation. And unfortunately, a nightmare is what most people are going to think it is, which is why the speaker paused for like 10 seconds when that POI was asked. Because at the end of the day, did it really happen? Was this something that really happened to your physical body? And if it didn't happen, how is this any different from you feeling bad for something that you shouldn't be feeling bad about because it never really happened to you? You might feel like you lost a limb, but it did not happen. Why should your feelings be validated? Because it's actually just not the reality and not the truth. This is a very deep philosophical debate. And they cannot tell us that a lot of people are going to believe that just because this was simulated, the pain was as valid as real physical pain, because most people consider simulations as not real, and not real pain is in no way on the same level as real pain. You think they've been punished less. But even if you don't think they've been punished less, you think they are capable of immediate re-entry because they only lost 2 days and otherwise they should be good to go, which is something that literally Gov themselves thinks that that's the case. This is why CJ loses, because they only rebut the community parts of this argument without realizing that we are the only side that gives you a route to actually have state infrastructure that allows you to have a job. And even if you want to run away from your community, we're the only side that enables that through state policy. This is the most important argument in the round, because number one, it prevents future crimes, because it means people are less likely to re-offend, less likely to have to be a part of this debate overall, but also it generally helps communities overall in a big way. Next part of our extension that they really didn't deal with, but before that, I'll deal with opening government through POI.
As we identified, the perception of abuse and sexual assault in prisons, as well as the recidivism coming out of it, does a good deal in making people unsympathetic to prisoners since they're seen as violent and unstable on your side.
Okay, no, like it makes you feel sympathetic for them because you feel like they've been like sexually assaulted in prison as well, right? This is a comparative. Yes, you might think they've done bad things, but the fact that you think they've gone through physical pain is significantly more than this idea of they imagined pain and so you can't sympathize with them. Next, on the idea of community, Eric had in his argument why victims will stop reporting, why communities themselves will start taking up the idea that you must punish criminals on your own. There was absolutely no response to this. This is a fundamental breakdown of the justice system. But overall, communities are unfortunately integral for rehab because you won't be able to leave them, you will be a part of them. At the end of the day, we've beaten opening opposition on their own metric of you want rehabilitation, and based on preventing future criminals and future victims, we're winning this debate. But directly with OG at the end of this. Okay, OG says abuse is less likely when you can simulate it. Eric tells you the truth, which is abusive prisons are by design. Governments know exactly what they're doing when they refuse to put exceptionally cheap cameras and have them switch off at random times. It's because they actively want to make the most harmful environments possible in order to scare the shit out of prisoners and wipe their hands clean a bit by pretending like it's hard to regulate and legislate away. That is why when most governments try sensible prison reform, prisons get reformed. Abuse is more likely on their side because they don't think that it's real. You didn't actually lose a limb because here's your limb right now. And same thing in terms of resources. Resources often constrain you to make better policy because now it's no longer feasible to lock up half of your population. This means that on their side, they have much more scope for abuse. It's likely to go unquestioned. At the end of the day, abuse gets worse, but rehabilitation is significantly better on our side. Proud to oppose.